Welcome back to Beginning Fly Tying. I'm Raj Kletke, and this is part 2 of this series. Today we'll look at attaching materials to the hook. We've already looked at these principles of tying on materials, and we'll talk more about these as we continue today. However, I do want to look at one of my idiosyncrasies, which is number 3. I separate a placement wrap from tie-in wraps. Most books lump these together simply as tie-in wraps, but I feel there is a good reason, at least conceptually, to separate them, as we'll see later in this series. As I use the term, the placement wrap is a single wrap precisely placing materials on the hook. It may be the first wrap when you put materials in, it may be the last wrap when you put materials in, or it may be in between your tie-in wraps. The tie-in wraps are the wraps that anchor the material tightly to the hook. They may be 2 or more wraps, they may be put on before or after the placement wrap, and they may or may not be at the same location as the placement wrap. If you're tying along with this series and have completed part 1, you have your hook tightly in the vise and a nice thread base. You're ready to tie in the materials. However, some materials require preparation before tying in. While both pre-cutting the material before tying it in and cutting off excess after tying in work fine, I prefer to pre-cut the materials at the point of tie-in before attaching, at least whenever this is feasible. I believe this is faster and gives a neater fly. Except for splitting and thinning yarn to the amount you want, usually all you have to do for yarn, floss, some chenilles, and similar is to get a clean end if you want to pre-cut like I do. Getting a clean end is quite easy if you grasp the yarn near the tie-in end and roll your thumb and finger forward. Cut close to your thumb and finger where the material is well supported, which will then give a nice clean end, and then roll your finger and thumb back to expose the end to tie in. Preparing fibers from a feather is usually a case of being sure the ends of the fibers are aligned. This is easily done on most feathers by pulling the fibers perpendicular to the stem before pinching them and cutting them off from the stem. When tying a hackle in by the base, which is much more common than tying it in by the tip, you want a short distance of stem that is free of fibers. This is simply done by pulling the excess base fibers off with your right thumb and finger until you have the bare stem the length you want. We'll talk about the proper length of the bare stem later, as this does vary. A clump of hair takes a little more preparation. Pinch the clump of hair approximately halfway between the base and the tips as you cut the clump off the skin, and continue to pinch tightly. I clean the base of excess fur and short fibers with an old toothbrush. Some use a mustache comb, and some, I suspect, use a new toothbrush. Anyway, keep cleaning until no more fibers come out. Then switch hands and pull out any obvious way too long fibers. Next, put the clump of hair, the tips first, into a hair stacker to align the tips. I use an old 2x4 to tap the hair stacker on so I don't ruin the table where I do my tying. After about 10 taps, tilt the hair stacker and tap some more to get all the hairs aligned at one edge of the stacker. Keep this edge down as you position the hair stacker nearly horizontal with the tip end just slightly higher. Open the stacker so the orientation of the hair is in the same orientation that you'll be using them. In other words, if the hair tips will be pointing toward the back of the hook, point the tips to the left and remove the hair cluster with your left hand. If the tips will be pointing toward the front of the hook, point the tips to the right and remove the hair cluster with your right hand. This helps minimize the handling of hair. Dubbing we'll discuss later, so now you're ready to tie in some materials. But where should we tie these materials in? Of course, where to tie in is dependent on what part of the fly you'll be tying in and what you want to do with the material after tying in. Let's look at some common positions on the hook to use. tying on a hook shank from front to back is pretty obvious. Occasionally we'll tie materials on the bend of the hook. This is especially common with curved emerger or scud hooks. The end of the shank is the classical location to tie in the tail, ribbing, and body material. The front third of the shank is a common location to place or tie in the back end of the materials for the thorax, which may also include wings and legs in some patterns. The front of the shank is usually the farthest forward you want to tie materials in to allow a few thread wraps in front of any materials just behind the hook eye. If you carry materials too far forward, you may crowd the eye and have difficulty tying the fly to your tippet. Crowding the eye is a common problem with beginners and intermediates alike. Less obvious, but also as important, are the positions around the hook. Many, if not most, materials are tied to the top of the shank. Less commonly, materials are tied to the bottom of the shank. However, you should always remember that some materials are best placed on the side of the hook, either the near side or the far side. I'll demonstrate this later, but I generally like the initial material wrap to go under the shank, so materials that I'll be winding in the usual direction I place on the far side of the hook. Materials like ribbing that I like to reverse or counterwind, I place on the near side of the hook. We now have prepared the material and know where we want to place it. The first method that I'll use is the soft loop technique. I'm pinching a piece of chenille tightly to the top of the hook shank at the position I want the material placed. I pull the thread up on my side of the hook between my thumb and the hook and down on the other side of the hook between my finger and hook, keeping the thread loop in my pinch. While keeping a tight pinch, I pull the thread down and slightly towards me. The material will stay in position. Keep tension on the thread, but you can make minor adjustments to the position if needed. I'm using the first wrap as the placement wrap. I can then tie in the material with additional wraps at the same location, although commonly I'll move my thread forward towards the thorax where I can use the tie-in wraps without bulking up the tail region. Here I'm using the soft loop technique to tie in a shuck tail of Zelon. I've positioned my thread near the thorax of the fly and trimmed the end of the yarn straight. I put in a couple of tie-in wraps and then pull the yarn to adjust the front end for length so I don't have to cut any excess. I then tighten the tie-in wraps and keeping tension on the yarn with my left hand so it stays on top of the hook, I wind my thread back in loose spirals to my placement wrap at the tail. I can then cut the shuck to length. Note that here I put the tie-in wraps first and the placement wrap last. The soft loop is quick and easy, and with slight variation can be used almost universally to tie in almost any material to any position. But it allows only minimal adjustment to the position after the placement wrap, and because the placement point is obscured behind the pinch, it's not as precise either for placement on the hook or length of the materials in front of the placement point as some other methods. However, I do use this method frequently. Next, we'll use a tight line placement technique. Wrap your thread to the placement point and put the material on the near side of the hook at a 45-degree angle to the hook shank and thread. Be sure the length of tail is precisely placed at the placement point also. Adjust it if needed. Pinch the material tightly in place, still on the near side of the hook. Keep tension on the thread as you wrap it over the hook shank. The tension will bring the material to the top of the hook at the placement point. You can then tie it in with additional wraps at that location or spiral your thread forward to a different tie-in point. If you're spiraling your thread forward, keep your left index finger tight against the far side of the hook if the material tends to want to spiral around the hook shank. I commonly use a tight line placement for hackles also, as it allows me to precisely place where I want the hackle to start. First, I move my thread to the placement point. With a hackle, you must decide whether you want the concave side, the dull side, or the convex side, the shiny side, forward when you wind the hackle in. When you use a tight line tie-in, the material moves 1/4 of the way around the hook shank, but also twists approximately 1/4 turn. Here I want the convex side facing forward, so I have that side facing me at the start. My tight line placement wrap takes the hackle to the top of the hook and twists it so the convex side is now facing up. I do my tie-in wraps forward on the stem and a locking wrap behind the hackle. Don't worry about a locking wrap at this time. I then spiral my wraps forward to where I want to tie off the hackle. You can see how the hackle twisted properly so now I can easily wrap it with the convex side forward. Incidentally, there are easier ways of wrapping hackle or other materials, which I'll show you later. So, the tight line placement allows very accurate placement of materials and is very useful for throats, beards, and distribution wraps, which we'll talk about in another part of this series. But it is a little more difficult than the soft loop technique and does take some practice, especially for the distribution wrap. For the thread control placement, I get the thread to the placement point and then spin the bobbin counterclockwise, as I already showed in part 1 of this series. The thread should then kick to the left if you remove thread tension. Move the materials into position, wrap your thread over the materials, release the thread tension, and use your thumb and fingers to block the leftward movement of the thread. Then pull the thread tight as your placement wrap. Add additional tie-in wraps at the same location, or move your thread to the wanted tie-in site. I use the thread control technique frequently and especially like it for positioning a hair caddis wing. After measuring the hair cluster for length, I move the cluster into my left hand. I then roll my fingers forward to give firm support as I pre-cut the hair to length. Keeping a tight pinch on the hair, I move it into position and roll my fingers back to expose the head hair while I'm spinning my thread counterclockwise. I block the leftward movement of the thread with my thumb and fingers, using the thread control technique to accurately place my positioning wrap. I then add tie-in wraps at the same location while keeping my left index finger tight against the far side of the hook to prevent the hair from slipping around the hook. I usually like to pull the head hair up and put some more wraps just behind the eye of the hook before finishing the fly. Thread control positioning is quick and easy as long as you remember to get the thread control by spinning the thread counterclockwise. It provides very accurate placement with minor adjustments still possible, although not quite as accurate as the tight line positioning. But, well, actually I can't think of any significant downside to thread control positioning. I use it frequently, but I'm not aware of many others using it very much. We'll often place materials in the same front and back location, but at different positions around the hook. Here I've placed the tail on top of the hook, the fibers for the body on the far side of the hook, and the ribbing material on the near side of the hook. I use a single placement wrap for each material at the end of the shank to prevent thread buildup at this tail region. I've placed my tie-in wraps forward on the hook. I'm ready to move my thread forward to tie off point, cover the rest of the rib that's on the hook already if desired, and form my thread underbody again if desired. Then I can wrap the body and rib material. We now know how to prepare material and how and where to place the material and tie it in. We're ready to start working with the tied-in material. Join me for Beginning Fly Tying Part 3. We'll look at dubbing, forward and reverse wrapping of materials, and tying in wings, including how to post up a wing. See you soon.